In this video, I'm going to be removing the engine from my Yamaha Virago. This procedure is going to be almost exactly the same for any Virago 1988 on and 700cc or above, and for the previous Viragos, it's going to be very similar. As you can see, this bike has some modifications done to it, but those are not going to significantly affect this procedure. A little bit of background on this bike. You can skip this part if you want, but this is a 1992 1100. It's got 22,000 miles total on it. The last 3,500 of those are mine. I got this about a year and a half ago, did all the bobber stuff to it. I rode it pretty hard last season. I was running really good for the most part, and then put it away in storage for the winter. When I got it back out, it wouldn't fire up. Kind of did some troubleshooting, figure out why, and I figured out that the head gaskets were leaking quite a bit and the compression was low. Factory compression on these bikes is supposed to be about 155-ish PSI per cylinder. This one was only doing about 100 on each cylinder. So I suspect maybe an overheating issue. I'm hoping to find out more about what happened once I start tearing into the motor. But yeah, it's got leaking head gaskets and no start condition. I'm gonna go ahead and start out on the right side of the bike and just disconnect everything on this side that I'm gonna need to disconnect to get the motor out. Then I'm gonna work my way to the front and around to the left side. And once you get back in here, you can just barely see it. There's a hose clamp in there. It's gonna hold it to the frame. Now that we have access to the carb, the next step is gonna be to remove the throttle cable. I like to leave these top two nuts in place when I remove the carbs. That way I know where my throttle cables were positioned at when I put them back together. Just grab a 10mm wrench, loosen these bottom two nuts here. Pop these out of the bracket, and these will just slide right out. I have to push these forward into the holder up here, just to get them out of the way. Next, we can go ahead and remove the fuel line. Just for the carb, just go ahead and get this little hose clamp off. Grab a catch can if you want. I'm not too worried about it. A little bit of fuel come out. Just unhook this. That fuel line is going to stay with the bike, so you can just leave it as is. Next up, we're going to remove the intake for the carb. The intake setup on this bike is kind of weird. The air cleaner feeds into a hollow space in the top tube of the frame underneath the tank. So you can see the air comes in here, and then it goes through this kind of air box in the frame and goes back into the carbs through these ducts here. So these little metal cosmetic covers, you want to pull those off. A little trick I like to use on this bike to get better access to stuff underneath the tank is just to prop it up on a piece of 2x4. Technically, you should be removing the gas tank to do this job, but on this bike, that's a real pain in the ass because you have to drain the entire fuel system. And I'm gonna try to remove the motor without removing the tank because it's got a full tank right now, and it makes it even harder to remove. I've done it this way to remove the carburetors before. You see, you've got these two fuel lines in here, one big and one small. You can kind of see those, but those are hooked onto the tank with hose clamps up here. And in my experience doing this a bunch of times, it's never put too much stress on those fuel lines to where they're at risk of breaking, so you can support the tank like this. So to keep removing this intake line here, you gotta get up here in this hose clamp, and there's another hose clamp up there. You can just barely get on with the screw. So go ahead and remove that, pull the intake off for the front carb. This right here is the crank case breather line. It runs through the front cam cover up to the air box in the frame. I found the easiest way to take that out is just to go ahead and take the cam cover off. Let's put that back on the engine so we don't lose it. So if you follow the wires from the starter on the front of the engine, down below the crankcase and up to the battery, positive terminal of the battery on the other side, on the left side of the bike, is going to the starter. So unfortunately, I'm gonna have to pull the battery out to get to it. It's always a fight on this bike. The only way I've found to really make it easier is to pull out this upper battery tray mounting bolt and then kind of shift this whole assembly up just a little bit to get over the frame down here. Come on. There you go. Okay. So go ahead and put this on the battery tender while I'm at it. So next I'm gonna have to try to snake these wires through the passageway between the back of the engine and the battery box area. So it's probably gonna be kind of hard to see on video, but see if we can get those out. I've already got this one disconnected right here. You can't really see it, but where my middle finger is back here, there's a connector for that. So you follow this wire down here up and it connects. You can kind of see it wiggling right there. It connects way up here. This connector is just buried in there behind the battery box. So I'm gonna grab that and just pull it free. That's gonna snake right out. All right, so that's 2 out of 3 wires coming out of the starter assembly that are disconnected, and the last is just this positive battery lead. So there is a connector for this part of the battery lead here. And if you're working on a stock bike, you won't have this issue, but see that white connector back in there? I have to remove the seat pan to get to it, and that's just such a pain with how I have this power conversion done. I'm just gonna go ahead and cut this wire and put another butt connector in there when I put it back together. That way it's easier. All right, there we have it. That's definitely not the by the book way to do it, but it worked. There it goes. There it is. Got the kickstand bracket off. It's just 2 14mm bolts. Just one right here on the rear engine mount bracket here, and then one right here on the crankcase itself. Or sorry, it's down here actually. That's the kickstand mount. So once you get that off, the easiest way to disconnect this wire is just to take this switch off the kickstand body and just leave it with the bike. So the problem I'm running into now that I've made it around to the left side of the bike, we got kickstand switch wire disconnected, but these 2 wires right here that run to the stator, those are clipped in behind the fuel feeder tank, which is behind this cover. So they're buried in there pretty good. Maybe easier to access on a stock Virago. It doesn't have this seat pan on it, but I'm gonna go ahead and just do some finagling to try to get those connectors out by kind of working this tank out of the frame, because I really don't want to have to take this seat pan off if I don't have to. So actually, an easier potential solution to that problem would be to remove this cover back here. So I'm gonna go ahead, go around to the other side and try to get these screws out and see if I can access the connectors for these wires from behind this plastic plate here. Ah, shit, drop a screw. Great thing about doing this job is if you drop a fastener somewhere, chances are it's just gonna come right out with the engine. All right, so let's see what we got here. There's one connector I need. Yeah, it's gonna be hard to get removing this on video, but you can see that line up there going to this connector behind the fuel filter. Yeah, you can't really see it, but I think I can get both connectors disconnected from just reaching back here. So if you need an easy way to access those, just pop this cover off and you'll get to it. Well, I didn't really want to have to do it like this because it's a pain with how I have the bobber conversion set up, but I didn't take off the seat pan. The way I had the seat pan design was it mounted with these 2 1/4-inch bolts here, and under here, this PCC here, that's the regulator rectifier. So I used some of these holes here to mount it and run those up to the seat pan. So I just had to take those off, pull the seat pan out, and to get to the connectors for the charging system, it's just this black connector here, and then this blue to blue bullet connector. So now that that's free, should be able to just snake down through that pocket in the frame, and then we'll have the engine, the charging system, electrically disconnected from the bike. All right, got the wires out. You can see they got them all snaked through the frame. One thing I will say, these 2 bolts that hold the feeder tank in, if you just back these out and loosen them and just let this float, that's gonna give you way more clearance to pull those cables out. So that's one of the few things that's different on my build than it will be if you're doing this on a stock bike. So take it with a grain of salt. Your procedure might be completely different if you're working on a different bike. Real quick, one thing I forgot to do is disconnect the rear exhaust. So that's gonna be these 2 nuts back here. I've got Cobra pipes on this bike, so the stock one might be a little bit different. So once you get these 2 bolts off, one on each side, I found it's easiest just to let the exhaust hang in the frame, because this is part of the pipe right here, and it'll just kind of hang down there and be out of the way. There's just one little 10 mil bolt that holds this air induction system cover in. So to get it off, just have to take that off real quick. And the easiest way is just to pull these little hose clamps down and just slide these vacuum lines off just like that. There's also another vacuum line that goes in the back of the system right here and up to the front. And you can very easily just take this hose clamp off here and slide it off. Or another thing you can do even easier, this little nipple right there, it'll just come right off. And there she is, air induction system. When I first started working on this bike, I was like, what the hell is this thing? Is this an EGR? Next up is gonna be the intake for the front carb, or the rear carb, excuse me, and then the choke cable. And that'll just squeeze on out, just like that. The choke cable's not hard at all. Just loosen this one screw here. And then you can just pop it right out and just like the throttle cable, you can just shove it forward in this bracket, and that'll keep it out of the way when you're moving the engine. This next part can be a little bit tricky, the clutch cable. First step is to get into this cover. So if you're not familiar with how this clutch linkage works, so when you pull the clutch cable up on the handlebar, this will come up and pull this lever arm this way, just like that. So what that's doing is it's rotating a little roller bearing assembly right behind this plate here, and that's pushing a push rod that goes all the way through the crankcase to the other side where the clutch basket is. That's what's actually in the clutch. So unfortunately, there's really no better way to do this. You got to get tension off of this somehow. You got to get this up without pulling the clutch cable in. So you try to get something in there to pry it, see if that'll work. That's probably not a good idea. All right, I'm gonna try a different way. I'm gonna try to just push up on it with the end of this screwdriver here. See if I can pop that cable out. Not quite. Oh, that's what I was missing. There's a little tab back here that you need to bend to get to it. See that? Yep, that's what's keeping the cable in. So now we got that tab out of the way, the cable end should come out. There she goes. All right, we can just snake this out. And if you go up here, the cable is mounted to, that's on there pretty good. But you can just take that bracket off and put that screw back in the stator cover, and then you'll be able to move the clutch cable forward up into this bracket up here to get out of the way. All right, so at this point, the engine is mechanically and electrically disconnected from the frame, and it's ready to come out. You can see I got the wires for the starter tucked up here, so they're out of the way. And then if you go over to the other side, just kind of loop the charging system wires around and keep them out of the way too. I wanted to talk a little bit about how to pull this engine out by yourself. I would highly recommend having an assistant if you can, if you have one available. My best estimate is this engine probably weighs about 200 to 225, somewhere in there. It's very heavy, and when you pull it out, you're gonna be balancing it on a floor jack underneath it while you roll it out of the frame. So keep that in mind. It's physically pretty difficult, and if it's not something that you feel like you can do, definitely get an assistant if in doubt. The way the engine is mounted in this bike is a little bit strange. It's not like most other motorcycles. As you can see, there's no bottom tube, there's no down tube. So the engine is acting as a structural member of the frame and triangulating it for stiffness. So the mounting points for the engine are up here. You got these two bolts that attach the front cylinder head brackets to the frame. You have these two bolts back here, one on each side of the rear cylinder head. Just add some stability. Those are going to come out first. And then back here, you have this bolt up here and a corresponding one on the other side. Yep, there it is right there. Those are actually threaded in to nut plates. You can't really see it, but nut plates on the back of the engine mounting brackets in the frame. And then lastly, you've got this guy right down here, this bolt that runs all the way through the frame. That's that same nut that we removed when we took the kickstand mount plate off. So those are your mounting points for your engine. You want to get a floor jack positioned underneath it, underneath the center of gravity, and then get ready to start pulling the bolts out. So I've got my jack positioned right under the engine center of gravity. At least that's the best estimate of it. You can get some screen grabs of that. And then over here, I've got some 4x4s spaced just a few inches apart. And what it's going to allow me to do is when I roll this engine out, I'll have it balanced on the jack, I'm gonna pick it up off the jack, carry it over, and set it down so that the flange between the two crankcase halves will sit between the 4x4s, and the 4x4s will support the engine under each half of the crankcase. So now we're ready to start actually pulling the engine out. You'll want to have your front wheel turned all the way to the right to the stop, and you're just going to kind of back the bolts out and then roll the engine out, curving it off to the right, and just keep it balanced on that forward jack the entire time. One thing to keep in mind when you do this, you want to back all the bolts out, loosen them before you remove any of them. You don't want to have any fully torqued down bolts in the engine while other bolts are being completely removed. You could risk bending the frame that way. The only exception to this rule is these two bolts up here, because these really just stabilize the rear cylinder. They're not really structurally supporting the engine so much. At least one of these front bolts is probably going to be pretty much completely loose once you remove the nuts. So that can be the first one you take out. So this one here, you can see it's just hanging in there. Go ahead and slide that one out. To make sure there's plenty of tension on this jack, you should just barely be able to see the bike raise off the ground. So that way you have enough tension to support the engine once you get the bolts all the way out. Next bolts to come out are going to be the ones on the top rear of the engine here. That way it's still supported at both the front and the rear ends by the forward front bolt, and then the rear one that runs through the bottom of the crankcase. At this point, it's advisable to do one final check to make sure you have everything disconnected before you pull the engine out. And I'm really glad I did that because I realized I forgot something. The rear brake switch back here, that has a wire that's connected way up in here that would have come out with the engine if I hadn't caught that. So it always it helps to double check. I'm gonna go ahead and remove that. There's the last bolt. All right, now for the tricky part. You can see the engine is free in the frame. So we gotta start letting some pressure off very carefully off the jack while keeping this engine stable with one hand. All right, we got some movement, just coming down. Okay, go ahead and tighten it up. I'm gonna start pulling that jack forward. Slow and steady wins the race here. All right. So the engine's free. We just have to very slowly start working it down and forward, just one little bit at a time. And it turns out I forgot one more thing. I forgot to disconnect the wiring harness from the ignition coils. That kind of thing will get you. Show you real quick what I forgot to disconnect. The ignition system. This goes to the wiring harness here. This goes to the vacuum operated electrical switch. It advances the timing when it reaches a certain vacuum pressure. So I just need to disconnect all of these. I'll have this video for reference on the order they go into, but once I get all these pulled out, then the engine will be ready to go. So those little details like that really get you. This thing is just kind of precariously perched here on top of this jack, and that's not a good time to realize that you forgot something. So don't be like me and do that. Get a good handhold on this front cylinder head here. Put my knee on here to brace it too. Okay. Should be low enough to start rolling it forward more. There she goes. All right. This fuel line untangled. As low as the jack will go. So now it's just a matter of keeping it stable and rolling it out. Oh, got it. That was tough. Done this a couple times and it never gets any easier. All right guys, that's gonna do it for this video. Got the engine out, and there she is. This will give you a little bit better idea of what I was messing with while I had the camera in one spot. So these are those nut plates I was talking about on the frame right here and right here, where those two bolts come in, one from each side, and go through the engine. And then the spot for the other bolt is right down here. You can see the exhaust we just got hanging there in the frame. You'd have to get this bike way up high to pull it out. And then back here, this is the drive shaft here. So the U-joint on the back of the engine, or transmission rather, when you put it back in, you have to spline that U-joint into this shaft right here. Yep, you can see the fuel line and the wiring harness for the ignition are pretty much the only things that stay with the bike when you remove the engine. So, all right, got it done. In my next video, I will start tearing into this thing, and we will figure out why she wouldn't start up, and get a top end rebuild and get this thing back on the road. Thanks for watching.